clinical trials. And she was a protocol co-chair of the project and the project director of the other study, a 10-year follow-up study, which was looking at acute HIV infection, again, at Capresa. She has co-authored, I think, about over 100 peer-reviewed articles. She's the member of the board of South African Medical Research Council, and she currently chairs the Ministerial Advisory Committee focusing on antimicrobial resistance, as well as being the member of the board of trustees for the South African National AIDS Council. Professor Mlisana was also one of the women in leadership in 2020. And she's currently leading the MEC, right? You are the chairperson of the MEC. So guys, please join me in welcoming this. I don't know how to describe you. Phenomenal. Left woman.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Musa, for that generous introduction. And I guess I should say good morning, good day, good afternoon, depending on which country you are in right now, everybody. And for those that are in the house and are not local, welcome to our lovely and beautiful country. And it's always great to have face-to-face meetings. We have missed that for the past 2.5 years. And I find that wherever I go now, a lot of people are, I'm seeing people I haven't seen for 2.5 years, and some of them have grown older, some of them have grown younger. But it really is just great to also see faces, when we sit at meetings like this, because we truly have been through a very difficult time. But anyway, let me also just take the time and thank the organizers for asking me to do this presentation. It's an honor, and I'm hoping that we can have a conversation, really. And when Musi called me and wanted a title, she laughed at me. I'm not talking more about data today, more than I felt I really wanted to take us and walk through where we have come from, what have we learned, and my greatest concern and question, which ones that we learn through any experience. What do we do with those lessons? How do we make sure that we implement those? Because it's very easy for us to sit here and say, lessons learned, during HIV, epidemic. And right now, everybody's looking at what the lessons learned. Everybody who asked me to speak, lessons that you learned, in the MEC, as the MEC on COVID committee, lessons learned, with the COVID-19 pandemic. But what the question we're not asking ourselves is, what are we really doing? How are those lessons informing us to do better at whatever comes up next? For instance, now we're talking pandemic preparedness. How much of whatever that we have learned are we truly going to implement? And I don't think we are there yet. I think we really are very far from that. And I'm just hoping that this can stimulate such thoughts and we can see if we can do things a little bit better next time. I'm pressing the arrow down and nothing is moving. Should I be pressing something else? Okay, okay. All right, so, just preparing for this, I came across quotes. I think I'm going to just make 2 quotes, and they're both from UNAIDS. One is the UN Secretary General, and this was a report in 2020, wherein he says, the COVID pandemic, this was just, much earlier in the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the inadequacy of investments in public health, the persistence of profound economic and social inequalities, and the fragility of many key global systems and approaches. And I mean, when you read that, this is what everybody says every day. And he was saying this in 2020, and I can promise you, whatever report that may have been written, midway with the HIV, epidemic, a similar quote could have been said. And the question really revolves around, we're going to be talking about inadequacy of investments in public health until when? We're going to be talking about economic and social inequalities until when? Or is it just okay for us to mention it and we're seen as being politically correct? And I think that bothers me because we keep saying this. Now, he was talking about COVID-19, but if you listen to the recently, published UN report in 2022, just after the AIDS conference, the executive director there says, marks within and between countries are stalling progress in the HIV response. And HIV is further widened by those inequalities. Still the same thing, inequalities. We've had, we've lived with HIV now for 40 years. And that's why I thought my talk really is let's just look at what are some of the differences and similarities between HIV and the recent, pandemic, COVID-19. And then, do a memory lane walk for us South Africans, what we have lived through. There was an era of AIDS denialism in the country, wherein, Musi and I, will remember when you went to any AIDS conference, you actually would be ashamed to tell them that you're South African, because there was this clout around us about AIDS denialism. And then, very soon afterwards, actually, almost parallel, then there rose this voice of advocacy. And, just to remind ourselves what was done then and what was achieved by all of that. And take that now to say what then became the response. And I will, when I'm looking at the response and looking at programs, because I'm a microbiologist, I'm a laboratory person. So just look at how the diagnostics, what role it played and what it allowed us to do, which in a way actually prepared us for this pandemic that we currently went through. And then look at then, how things changed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then what are some of the lessons that we have learned? Going back to what I was saying, how do we make sure that we carry those through? Now, there's something that is disturbing me here, and it's my face. I don't know how to shift this. How do I get rid of that? Thank you. Okay, so just very briefly, I mean, if you look at HIV and COVID-19, now we know they are, viruses, they're both viruses, and we've seen how viruses have come, causing pandemics and outbreaks. And we know the origin, countries of both viruses. When, we've lived with HIV since 1981, and now we had COVID-19 in 2019. They're both zoonotic infections from animals, and they're actually both RNA viruses, and now if you're looking at the difference, if you're looking at HIV, I remember the one challenge thing, and that's why we still haven't got a vaccine today for HIV, was the fact that, the mutation rates of HIV are much more than, if you're looking at COVID-19. And so you find that most of the times it just becomes difficult and a lot more challenging to actually get a vaccine, for HIV. But we're hoping that the gains of vaccine development we have seen with COVID-19 are going to then improve and ensure that we can soon get to a stage where we can say we've got an effective HIV vaccine. We really have tried, within HVTN, trying to come up with a vaccine that's going to be effective and cause sustainable, immunity. We know with HIV, the fact that it is a lifelong, it's a chronic infection, as opposed to 10 days, that we see with COVID-19. And, when we're educating the community about COVID-19, the question was, how can you get a vaccine within a year, for COVID when you still haven't got a vaccine for HIV? Something must be, fishy. There's something going on. And I mean, we've seen the fatalities. In the absence of antiretroviral therapy, we saw how we lost so many lives, you know, in the early 90s before the advent of ART. And yet, if you're looking at COVID-19, I mean, we've seen these massive infections. Yes, there have been a lot of deaths, you know, but comparing it to HIV, it really is a significant, an insignificant, you know, a death is a death anyway. But if you're looking at just the 1%, especially those that require, you know, oxygen and ventilation, those are the ones that often succumbed to COVID-19. And that's the one thing that helped us as we ventured into COVID-19 testing. And where are we in so far as a number of infections? More than 80 million people, you know, have been infected with HIV, and of those, only just, you know, 49% of them are alive. Talking back to mortality rates, whereas if you're looking at COVID-19, right now we have got more than 600 million, you know, people who have been infected with COVID-19, and infections continue. But if looking at the deaths, we, you know, looking at the world data, there's just about 6.5 million deaths. So really, there are these differences, but when we're looking at the responses, there are a lot of similarities that we can, you know, we can actually look at, provided you move to the next slide. It's not. I promise you, I'm pressing. Okay, so this is busy, but I already think just a few things to highlight here. This is the story of HIV. In that, when you're looking at HIV, really, you know, it took us years to even just diagnose and understand what was causing this, you know, unknown illness, what it was and when it was named. And you find that even just to get the diagnostic, like an ELISA, to test for HIV, it took, you know, from 1981, we only got that by 1985. And let alone coming to treatment, it was a long and a protracted time. I remember the first time in this country we heard about AZT. I mean, I was a medical student without divulging my age, you know, and I was never taught about HIV as a medical student. I knew nothing about HIV. So when I was working as a pathologist, and all the private, I was in the private sector then, and all the doctors were seeing this funny infection, because then in the public sector, there was no treatment, and I'm going to come to that very shortly. And so treatment started in this country in the private sector. Everybody was asking, what is this? What is AZT? And this was around 1991. Where was AZT? Yeah, 1990. That's the first time where there was like some hope. And it took another 3 to 4 years before the most effective heart came into, into play by 1995. And this was only available, elsewhere, but not in this country. And by that time, we had seen the infections increasing and climbing each day, until there was the AIDS 2000 conference, which I know to every, HIV researcher in this country, that often brings most of the time sad memories because of what was happening around that time. Because then for the first time, the AIDS International Conference came into this country in 2000. And I think that was the first time that the global community got to experience HIV and AIDS very, face to face, and they saw what was happening to this country. That's when, following that conference, we began to see negotiations about drug prices, bringing them down and making it available and accessible to us. And so really you can see that if you look at the timelines of HIV, then, ARTs, the PIs came in, and internationally we began to see reduced, mortality levels. People started to live longer, and there was a definite shift which was caused by the availability of hearts. Lo and behold, it took us another 5 years before we could get on board and get to start treatment. And really, there's been a lot of progress that has happened over the years insofar as HIV is concerned. Now, if you're looking at COVID-19, I mean, the first was in December 2019. And if you're looking at even at days and weeks, within a month, there was already, we knew what the virus was, and not just that, the full genome sequencing had been done. And it tells you how much technology advance had occurred over the years. And as a result, everybody got onto there was collaborative work to find a vaccine, and therefore not surprising that whilst we still don't have a vaccine for HIV that we have lived with for 40 years, within 12 months, there was a vaccine for COVID-19, just the advancement of technology and science. And so really we saw all of this happening, and we, within, by September, even before the, a full 12 months, people were, there were vaccines available. It came, because we started vaccinating in January 2021 globally, and within no time, we had like billions of people having received that vaccine doses, which means there are certain things, if we follow it properly and we do it properly with providing the resources for it, we can actually achieve some of this quite quickly. So this was our story. We found ourselves in an era of denialism where our famous president, Mbeki, was really saying, HIV does not cause AIDS. And those times there was this, Shapiro, for those who don't know, does cartoons, used to do cartoons on the newspapers. And we used to see this every time. And, in no time when cornered, then I never said HIV does not cause AIDS. And in fact, there was even an advisory panel that was constituted by the then president to actually have this panel that was looking at whether HIV does cause AIDS or not. And we had our famous, may the Lord, may his soul rest in peace, Prime Minister Manto Shabalala, and then there was this conference, AIDS conference that we went to, and there was a stand from the South African government. And what was on the stand? Vegetables, because that was the prevention, of HIV, at that point in time, wherein really she was promoting, garlic and beetroot and whatever you name it. And that time, sadly, we actually lost lives because of that, and we're not implementing And I do want to highlight here, as all this denialism, the good thing rate in our country, because for the first time, the communities realize that here our people, for me, it but insofar as the response is concerned, everybody has got a responsibility. And we saw the formation of TAC, mid-90s, and I was saying earlier on, and to task, which means when we have strong civil society organizations, things can change because they really can put pressure as long as they ensure that they fight for the right cause. And as a result, we found ourselves post the conference, prices coming down, and then there was a big move to initiate antiretroviral therapy, and specifically for mother to child, treatment. And we have seen the positive impact of this. So really, civil society rose into prominence, in the 90s, and this was rooted within communities, because when we talk about civil societies, we really need to talk about organizations that truly represent the communities that we are talking about. And this was an integral part of democracy in our country, and they were able to reach out to the marginalized and the disenfranchised. And in fact, they continue to be a reminder of what we're all about, ensuring that the rights of the people are maintained and there's justice that is actually maintained throughout. And I'm sure some of you will remember, the famous Johnson, who made a moving speech globally, at the AIDS 2000 conference. And this was the order of the day during HIV. We saw marches everywhere because civil society, the voice of the communities, was demanding what was rightfully theirs. And as a result, there was this massive, response, from the global community and as well from the government ultimately. So we saw the formation of NACOSA. We saw the establishment of the South African National AIDS Council, which is still operating today, and its task is specifically to look at the HIV, TB, and STI response in the country. And we have seen funding coming through. And so these really were the fruits and the benefits of what actually happened there. And this just takes us through all the, the timelines of what happened, how we got to end up having antiretroviral therapy available. I mean, you can see here the impact of HIV treatment. The number of people that were living with the virus started to increase. There was a definite shift when antiretroviral became available in the country around 2005, 2006. And you can see, the life expectancy had actually gone significantly down during the denialist phase, and we began to see it cropping up. And the concern now is the gains that we made in the early 20s. Are we going to be able to sustain? And we've got the 1990 targets. How far are we from that? Are we going to be able to sustain that, especially in the backdrop of COVID-19? And during this time, like I was saying, it therefore forced the country as a whole to have a focus on HIV. And what happened in the diagnostic platform, we were actually able to invest on molecular technologies that were established in the country to test for HIV, whether it was for HIV, for TB, or for early infant diagnosis, CD4 counts. And so we were able to set these processes up. And in fact, the digital systems and integration happened, at laboratory level. And talking about the NHLS, we then were able to actually get an LIS, a lab information system, that is across the footprint across the national footprint in every lab in the country which is a public health laboratory. And we then were able to have a single LIS, which meant that the data from the public sector is actually in one central data warehouse. And this resource was built. And this is exactly how we managed to respond as we did as a country to COVID-19. And so, those years of viral load testing, and molecular TB testing, and now we use these platforms for COVID-19 testing. And these are as a result, there's a little bit of data here, and you can see, because what this is looking at the impact of COVID, because this is starting from 2010, and you can see how the CD4 testing dropped, and this was around the pandemic. And that's another lesson we need to learn, that whenever there's an emergency, there's a crisis. Yes, it's important to create resources for the crisis, but do not neglect the rest of the services, because otherwise you then reverse all the gains that you have had in those programs. And we saw this specifically around CD4 testing and the gene expert testing, because for gene expert we are focusing on on COVID-19 testing, and as a result there was a delay, and we ended up with less testing of TB, and now we need to do the catching up of those gains that have been lost. And I think what we have as a country, some of the uniqueness is that even though we had the highest numbers of HIV infected individuals, when the tide turned, we actually ended up leading in the number of people who are on antiretroviral therapy. And right now we've got the largest, antiretroviral therapy program, which means as a country, when we set our mind to do things, we're able to get things done. We just need to set the mind at the right time, and we need to do it quickly, because otherwise we end up losing first and only catch up much later. And maybe, there's a few things that we can learn as to how we responded to COVID-19. And let me just skip this in the interest of time and come to what then happened with COVID-19. There was a very, I must say, for the first time, government responded, promptly. We saw our president, and we had our family meetings. Good evening, South Africans. Everybody knew it would be tools down, and everybody would be watching TV, hearing the father of the nation speaks. So there was an immediate response. And if you're looking, for instance, at the structures that were put up, the Minister of Health set up the Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID very earlier on. And this comprised of, the world-class researchers in the country, people who really led us through the pandemic, and we began to see how much investment had been made in science within the country as the scientists continued to lead the decisions that the politicians were making in responding to COVID-19. And I mean, you know, these are just some of the timelines of what actually happened within the country and how we saw governments, politicians embracing science. I mean, the Minister of Health was clear. Whenever he was making an announcement, he would get us as the chief COVID-19 and we would do the presentations and he would read political speech. So we saw the response. And from that, or people had really begun to understand the importance of science and how science can actually direct, you know, a policy and bring out the correct responses whenever we have, you know, pandemics. And one just hopes that we are going to continue to maintain that, even though towards, well, I mustn't say the end because COVID has not ended, but I mean, maybe in the probably the last 6, 9 months, there hasn't been that much. And even for us as the MEC as the Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID-19, we have struggled in saying, really, we're not sure who else is advising the Minister of Health, but obviously understanding that as politicians, they've got a lot of other bodies that they need to put whatever advice we put across to them that needs to go through. But we release engagement with science, and this is what we have been living through. And the gains that we had put and the resources we had put caused the South African scientists to really shine up globally. Because if you're looking at some of, these are the waves that we have gone through. That was the wave that was caused by, the Alpha variant, when we began to see the variants, and then we were able to actually pick up the second variant of concern, which was the Beta variant. That was actually first identified, in our country, and even the Omicron. That is what continues to circulate. It was picked up by the South Africans, and you can see that what the other big change with COVID-19 was just the collaboration, and I'm going to talk to this very briefly. Collaboration in the scientific field, where data was available, within days, and we're able to work with data and make the decisions that we made, even in the midst of actually being rejected at sometimes, by the other, countries for the data that we had put out there. But as scientists in the country, we felt it was important for us to ensure that whatever we discover in the country, it needs to go out there in the world. And lo and behold, within no time, we would see that same Omicron variant circulating, across the globe. So really, lessons learned, scientific evidence has got to guide public health response. Community involvement, we used to say this for HIV as well. And there was even a slogan that whatever you do without communities, you are actually doing it against them. But how much of that have we used, in our response to COVID-19? And we've always fought the stigma in HIV. Did that teach us any lesson to implement it with COVID-19? I don't think so. And the question is, what happens to these lessons that we're learning along the way? Political will and highest level of national leadership is critical. We saw this beautifully, expressed in HIV, and maybe for some countries, but there are certain countries I will not mention where there was absolutely no political will. And as a result, they lost lives. When do we learn to do the right things and do them efficiently and at the right time? Partnerships and global solidarity. We struggled initially with access to diagnostic kits and consumables, and it became really almost very difficult for us because there were certain countries that were holding those kits, and those kits could not be shared equally across the world. And the same thing we saw even with vaccine access. There were challenges in how vaccines become accessible. And unfortunately for us as a country, when the establishment of the MEC was much earlier on, and we saw scientists really coming becoming the face of the epidemic and leading the country. But the unfortunate and sad part of our country was all these stories of corruption and how our health systems just began to crumble and just could not cope with what we're faced with. And so it becomes important for us to see how do we uproot this corruption, but that's a talk for another day. And with the words, words of my friend and colleague and predecessor, actually as a co-chair, is Professor Bruce Karim. He would have this, presentation. This one was from the one that says the good, the bad, and I can't remember what the third was. But I mean, where he was basically just talking about our response to the pandemic. That there was open communication. We saw this. There were these meetings. He was much in media, and even. What also was important as the advisory committee, we had to insist that whatever advice we put through, because we're very clear, it's an advice, it's up to the minister whether to take it or not. But we just said, we made one plea. Can we please make sure then that once we have decided, but put it onto the public, put on onto a public, environment, so that at least South Africans can know what we had advised you followed our full advice, or if you had not, but otherwise let them know that when we're saying we're actually implementing a science-driven response to the pandemic, let it show, and where you differ with what we are putting on the table, let people know what we have put across. We saw the prompt, really, the expertise came into play in that, Professor Glenda Gray's team and leader Gail Becker, when we had the unfortunate event around the AstraZeneca vaccine, they came in full force, and within no time, the healthcare workers had a vaccine to take, and we really were able to roll up and promptly, get people vaccinated. So, but then, if we look at HIV, there was a strong voice from from civil society. But I don't know if I'm the only one. I did not hear that voice with COVID-19. And the question I'm asking myself is, why? Did we miss something? Because really there were very, very few, if any, civil society organizations that were specifically talking around issues of, COVID-19. And why is that when they had been so effective, in the HIV epidemic? And in fact, we found that most engagements occurred primarily within NEDLEC. But, the voice of the other CSOs, in my opinion, really was not heard. Because we really feel, the role of the civil society would have really been making sure that there's provision provision of access to justice in relation to human rights violations. During lockdown, we had lots of gender-based violence cases around that time. And so the question is, could we have voice around that time? There was a lot, with the lockdown and loss of income, loss of lives and livelihoods around ensuring fair access to food. Were there enough voices? Could we have done better? And, so could the societies also assisted, even with, community screening and testing programs that the country established. And I want to skip this because this is just one other arm where Solidarity Fund came in, and we saw business really availing funds to respond to the pandemic, which was a great fund. So we know that there were quite a significant challenges that the NGOs and civil society organizations felt during the pandemic, like everybody else. Loss of funding and restrictions in movement, and therefore they couldn't have face-to-face interactions. That might be some of the reasons that their voice was not that much, or for that matter, lack of coordinating structures, which could have then assisted in coordinating, the whole response from civil society. Those might be some of the reasons. So really, I think for me, just a few key things that we must keep remembering is that, it's important how we make our decisions, whether at political level, science level, in that we need to make sure everybody gets included. And right now, we say, leave no one behind. Service needs ensuring that, we've got a healthy infrastructure, our health system. And that's an area as a country that needs a strong, to be built strongly, because at the moment we are in really serious trouble insofar as the health facilities and health systems are concerned. And then the importance of communication, which maybe we failed, around COVID-19, especially around vaccination, because if you look at us as a country and the uptake of vaccination, unfortunately, we had this competition with infodemic in that, all of a sudden, everybody was an expert. I mean, right now, even my 10-year-old granddaughter was challenging me on vaccination. And I'm like, are you for real? I mean, really? You're going to tell me that, no, you can't vaccinate? I'm like, and who are you? You are 10 years old. But she felt she had an opinion. And this just shows the mess, media that was out there. And unfortunately, we need them to understand media better, because I wasn't prepared for this. Firstly, I mean, I don't know how to use social media. The only thing I think I'm comfortable with is Facebook. But everything else, I've got to ask somebody to tell me how to do this. It's a shame, probably, but I'm not shameful about it. I just don't know, and I'm not sure if I really want to know how to use it. But I think into the future, it's important for us to understand what tools are operating at that point in time, and how do we then use those tools to advance science or to advance our messages. Because I really just feel there was so much disinformation and misinformation out there, and the proper and real evidence-based information was somewhere in the middle. And people, therefore, it was difficult for people to differentiate as to what are the good sources of information and what are the not so good sources. And therefore, maybe into the future, we need somebody, and is important. So I will skip social behavioral science, because I really feel that's one area we have not taken time to understand, because even with whatever information, with the data that people were seeing, the data about vaccination, the importance and the impact of vaccination. They were seeing people dying, but still they would say, no, I will not be vaccinated. And you're like, how do you bring the two together? You understand, even medics, they were against some of the interventions that are being offered. And we need to understand, why is this so? And how do we then, improve such that the decision-making process gets to be informed to actually move people to the right decision-making. So the important things for me, community engagement is quite critical. Whatever successful strategies we find along the way, we need to see if they don't fit whatever pandemic we're facing. How do we repurpose that so that it can actually fit into where we need it to fit in? And then ensuring that no one is left behind. And like I have said, the social behavioral understanding, the science of social behavior needs to be better understood. And some of the other critical things, collaboration. I mean, we saw how all of a sudden the private and the public sector in this country worked so well together. Corporates, the mining, everybody would have these, calls and meetings with everybody in trying to strategize, how do we respond to the pandemic? And the relationships that in the last 2.5 years, so that we can build this together. And what's important as well is the agility. We need to be able to make decisions quickly, and see how we can cut down most of the red tape that we often go across, because that rapid response is what really makes the difference. Building resilient and sustainable health systems, I cannot overemphasize that, is critical. And continuing to strengthen the diagnostics. And right now, we have built such a great genomic surveillance network, and this needs to carry on, which means it must be funded, because if we don't look, you will not find. We will not know when the next virus hits us. Whereas if we continue with genomic surveillance, we will be able to pick those up. And I mean, great work has been shown already, which I have talked to. And then these collaborative scientific endeavors, they're very critical with rapid dissemination information. We need to be, and we want to be, evidence-based in whatever we do, and the sharing of knowledge is critical. And for me, already open, even things that you don't know, as we saw with the pandemic, it does build trust and it actually builds confidence even to the population. The minute we don't talk to our communities, then they're assuming there's something that we're cooking up for them. So we need to really we must be comfortable to say, this is what science is showing us, and therefore this is the decision that we make. And if something else happens tomorrow, we must be able to come back to them and say, we had said this to you last week, but this is the new evidence, which means we need to go this way. And so, which means we need to take the people with us as we go along, as we are, gaining more knowledge in whatever we're doing. So in conclusion, going back to my two quotations, in fighting HIV, the world was confront serious and multifaceted health crisis. Successful international efforts were rooted in a focus on innovation, so we need to continue with innovation. Respect for human rights. We seem to slip up on remembering the issues about human rights whenever there's a crisis, and this needs to be embedded in our minds and thoughts as we go along. Gender equality, still a problem now, and we need to continue to highlight this wherever we are. Community-based solutions, otherwise, these communities that were building and creating these solutions for, they are not going to take them up because they will not own them if they are left outside of that decision-making process. And ensuring that we take everybody along with us. And then the executive director says, what we need to do, it's not like we don't know what needs to be done. We know because we have repeatedly seen successes, over the years. What we really need is shared science, so open, and available scientific data so that we can make, informed decisions, strong services, building the healthcare services and the structures thereof, and social solidarity. Thank you very much.
For a wonderful presentation. I'm going to come to the front, and as I do, I'm looking around. Does anyone have a question? Do I want a bit of brave first question? Oh, perfect. I should have walked that way first.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a very bad English, I'm sorry for that. It was very interesting in the aspects of the non-governmental organizations. I work in disability themes, and that kind of organizations help us to contact people with disability that were excluded and in their houses. And most of them and their families didn't understand what they had to do. They have difficulties with not physical contact, or people with audition problems that read lips couldn't because of the mask. So it was not immediately moment we could understand the role of these organizations, and they knew the people that participate in the organization and in the community, so they help like a mediation between the medical or the emergency how to say, when the mask and the social separation, and they help us reaching those people that were inside their houses and didn't know what to do. So they identify if they are lacking of food, or they have having the prescriptions, and they help us reach those people that were away. So it was not immediately, and maybe the voice was not like so strong at national level, but they were working a lot in their community. That was a great like a learning for us, like micro level work. So we have to like learn that about, maybe it's a new role or a different role from HIV, like you said.
No, thank you. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more because I mean, as these pandemics come or any other crisis that comes up, that's why I was saying we need to look at the existing structures that are effective. How do we repurpose them for whatever crisis we're facing? Because correctly, as you say, I mean, for people who need to read lips, you can't ask them to put a mask. So we need to be able to identify those, and who else but the community and civil society would be able to actually identify whether that's a problem and how then do we, and we then gather together as to how to solve the problem. So I fully agree with you.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Mlisana. This was very educational, at least for me, and eye-opening, and I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. I have a quick comment and a question. The comment was in more of an agreement with what you suggested about social behavioral science or social science in general and the misinformation. That's one of the greatest battles we're facing nowadays. We work on those type of issues quite a bit. And one of the things that we're finding, of course, with a proliferation of social media nowadays and citizen journalists, there's a lot of information out there, and deciphering what is accurate and what is not makes it that much more difficult to discern what is the accurate information that's coming actually from the scientists. My question was, really, you piqued my interest when you talked about the sharing of data, and specifically when you mentioned about the Omicron findings that were shared with the world, and you kind of hesitated there whether or not they were accepted right away or took a little bit of to really believe in those findings. And one of the questions that you may be able to answer better is, when these data are shared, you said within days, it's available to multiple science teams around the world. How much are they taken at face value when they're shared? What I mean by that more specifically is, when you have when you have scientists, let's say in South Africa or in Brazil, coming up with this data and sharing with the world, is that accepted very quickly, or is it questioned more because it comes from quote unquote still not highly developed country versus coming from, let's say, Western Europe or the US or Japan or some of the other countries? Now, that at a scientific level, meaning do we look at, do scientists look at which countries potentially these data come from, or do they look at the science teams? Because within a scientific community, you have pretty good idea which scientific teams are very strong. And how does that compare potentially at the societal or political level where people are not really familiar with these scientific teams? Because one of the worries I have, as you were suggesting, that every day the data is questioned, potentially coming from somewhere, that those are days that we lose potentially in saving lives. So that was kind of more of a question for you, is the veracity of the data, is it questioned more if it comes from specific teams or countries than others? Thank you for your time.
No, thank you for that. I think actually it's an important question. And I would agree with the second bit, that especially because I mean the scientific world and researchers, we get to know each other. We get to know what groups are doing, what research they're doing and at what level. And you would find that, you would be more comfortable with data that's coming from a group that's faith and you have, you have worked with, or even you have seen their work, rather than people that you really don't know. And for those, that's a kind of data you want to see and make sure it's peer reviewed first before you can actually, have more confidence in it. But I guess the challenge that we often face is that with a crisis that we have seen with the pandemic, where we really didn't know the behavior and the characteristics of the virus, it was important to actually review everybody's data that was coming out, but always keeping in mind that this is still before full peer review. And so take it with a little bit of, not doubt, but to just say, whilst I see that this group is presenting this data, now I know that this is likely to happen, but I would rather wait until there's peer review and there's more confidence, and therefore, that data, you are convinced that it's more robust and it's really the correct data. So when you know the group, it's much better. But I would imagine that also the countries become a bias that we have, and we need to see how do we get out of that bias. That bias might be okay in that then we become cautious, but sometimes it can actually be stigmatizing or even, inhibiting use of data from other countries. And we end up focusing on specific and we lose out on some of the data that we could have learned a few things from. So I think it's a matter of striking the balance, but obviously, whilst we want the data to go out there quickly to actually undo the rigor of science, that's where we don't know, whatever comes out, you are more likely to accept it easier if it's from a group you know than if it's not. But we need to just see how we strike that balance in a crisis moment.
Okay. Oh, yes, right here.
Thank you, Prof, for the beautiful presentation. I have just a short question, Prof. I realized that, yes, you mentioned the issue of the slow response maybe to HIV and AIDS and the quick vaccine development that happened during COVID-19. That was really a commendable effort, Prof, from the medical professionals. I think, Prof, what is missing or maybe might still be missing is the involvement of the allied professions within the whole process, because I think it was done late, especially within the South African context, and it was left quite a number of them kind of in limbo, confused on how to intervene. Because I think COVID was not just a medical issue, but it also involved quite a number of other aspects of life. So I just want to check, Prof, with the current developments and preparations maybe for future pandemics, are there any plans that can be in policy that can also guide the allied professions that work closely with the medical professionals? Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much. So as I'm recommending here, and I think everybody else does, that we must make sure that we don't leave anyone behind. Now, how do you get to sit at the table? Are you going to wait until you are invited, or you're going to invite yourself in? And so for me, I think what becomes important is that for them, the allied will come up with programs that right now, we're a big issue of mental health in the country. And who is spearheading that? I'm not going to talk about mental health because that's not my space. And so I'm unlikely to go out there and say, whether it's social issues, I'm not a social scientist, but really you make your space, to the table. You create, you actually bring together, you presented packages for us as scientists to say, actually, yeah, that's true. We cannot do without you, but otherwise we are going to bulldoze you. And you know how efficient we are in doing that.
Thank you, Prof. People will wonder why I associate with you. Invite yourself. But what I want to, as a social scientist, I feel so challenged at this point. When we write these papers, these nice papers and present, we always say lessons learned. And now I'm feeling like I will say just lessons, because we need to unpack the learned. Your presentation was challenging the aspect of learned. And what do we mean about learned? Because we always have these lessons and really we don't learn. It's like when you go, you look yourself in the mirror, and when you get to the street, they say you forgot to remove something on your eye. So thank you very much. For me, that's just the challenge that you have left us with as social scientists. What do we learn? Because it looks like we see more than we learn. Thanks.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's one more question. I have one myself that, I don't know, get out of the camera. That, one of the challenges that science isn't a straight road. Science is complicated. One of the things through the COVID pandemic is the scientists who are doing the good research, the kind of peer-reviewed work that you describe, also, took paths that were, complicated, different paths, different approaches, and the communication that sits around it, which is the aha, you guys must be wrong, science must be the truth, and so there's turned into a kind of combative dynamic between the uncertainty of this road and the progress forward, and a general need to kind of pick at that. Are there strategies from the sciences that we can, bring across to help those communication domains?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I think it's actually a critical question. It reminds me, when you train as a medical doctor, you do your MBCHB, and then you specialize, and then the next thing, as a registrar, you are expected to teach undergraduates, and you ask yourself, I've never been a teacher, I don't know how to teach, but it's expected of you that you should know how to teach, because nobody trains you to teach. Nobody trains you to lead, but you're expected to lead. And I think it's the same thing for me here, in that as scientists, obviously, even the language that uses is trained to public. And so I agree with there's a need for some for training, as how do we explain these complicated phrases and names and concepts such that we can walk with the public and the public can get a better understanding. And we are not there. There are some might actually in nature know how to simplify things, but not every, in fact, most scientists are not able to do that. And so there's a need for that bridge, and I think it's lacking. I'm sorry, I know it's lacking. That's something that we need to work at, as to how do we then cross that bridge. But at the same time, I would say this to groups, that it's amazing how much the South African community has learned. With COVID now, everybody knows about a variant, everybody knows about genomics, surveillance and sequences, things that, were very difficult concepts, which means somehow we're able to translate and that information, and people manage to understand it. But I agree with you, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in how then scientists, convey the messages such that communities understand.
Well, thank you very much. Well, yeah, but one more round of applause. Yes, thank you. Okay, so Tamara, where are we going now? Coffee break. Perfect. So we can continue the conversation outside. Thank you.